Здравствуйте, дорогие ребята! Дистанционная образовательная программа, по которой мы начинаем занятия, это замечательная возможность не только попрактиковаться в восприятии английской речи, но и узнать много интересного. Программа «Обо всем на английском» Центра «Радость» познакомит вас с интересными фактами из истории мировой культуры. Ваш английский лексикон будет расширяться под звуки классической музыки и в знакомстве с шедеврами мирового искусства. Будет хорошо, если в ходе занятия вы начнете повторять как знакомые, так и новые для вас слова, фразы и выражения. Занятия составлены так, что для этого у вас будут все возможности. И еще несколько слов о правилах участия в проекте. 2 раза в месяц по воскресеньям вы будете получать ссылку на новое видеозанятие, которое можно смотреть в любое удобное время. Главное, во время просмотра не забывайте регистрироваться в анкете Google формы, ссылка на которую находится в описании ролика. Видеозанятия разделены на циклы. После просмотра каждого цикла из 4-5 занятий у вас появляется возможность потренироваться в прохождении тестирования на английском языке, повторить знание новых слов, терминов, выражений, ответить на вопросы на английском языке. Тестирование можно проходить трижды для достижения наилучшего результата. Пройдя тесты всех 4 модулей программы, вы получите итоговый сертификат «A Fencer of Beauty», что значит «ценитель прекрасного». Итак, прямо сейчас найдите в описании видеоролика, который смотрите, ссылку на анкету Google формы. Кликните по ней и заполните ячейки. А сейчас начнем наше путешествие в мир английского языка. So, dear friends, an exciting journey into the world of art and creativity is waiting for you. Hello, my young music lovers! My name is Masha, and we go on learning about musical instruments. I have received an email. Женя Иванов writes that he really wants to learn to play the trumpet and asked to tell about this wonderful instrument. Thanks, Женя, for your letter. It came just in time, because today we are going to meet the wind instruments. Wind instruments date back to ancient times. They were made of a reed, an animal-born horn, a large walnut shell, and a seashell. Primitive men used them in their daily life, hunting in wars and in rituals. These primitive tools have gradually developed and improved over the centuries and millennia. However, among various Paleolithic articles of material culture, there are wind instruments resembling modern ones. So, what is a trumpet? How did it appear? The trumpet is a wind instrument made of copper. Its origins come from instruments made from animal horns in ancient times. An example is the shofar, made from sheep's horn, which was played in Jewish temples. The Old Testament tells how the walls of Jericho came down. On the 7th day, the priests began to walk around the walls of the city, blowing trumpets. Their sound made the walls suddenly come down. Since then, the expression "trumpet of Jericho" has meant a very loud sound, a trumpet voice. In Scandinavia, instruments were made from mammoth tusk, the lure. Later, when they learned how to smelt iron, the horns were replaced by metal pipes. The ancestor of all wind-blown brass instruments is the horn. The progress improved the quality and shape of produced pipes. The thickness of the sheet metal the instrument was made of changed. The metal itself also changed from copper to bronze and silver. The trumpet has the highest playable range of any of the brass instruments. It is a player for dramatic moments in the orchestra, and no battle scene can do without it. It is the trumpet that gives the orchestra its solemnity. It can be loud, but it is also capable of a soft and quiet sound. In a wind ensemble, it plays the solo role, it plays the melody.
My name is Alistair Mackey. I'm one of the principal trumpets in the Philharmonia Orchestra. Any musical instrument depends on vibration. If you're a string player, you vibrate the string, which in turn vibrates the air and sends the sound out into the room. If you're a trumpet player, you vibrate the air inside of your instrument, and you do that by vibrating your lips, like this. The next stage is to get a mouthpiece. And what happens now is this. The trumpet itself, in some ways, really just amplifies what is happening there. This is a C trumpet. Different trumpets sound slightly different. They amplify that basic vibration in different ways. But the pitch of the trumpet is fundamentally changed by this tension in the lips, which creates a higher or a lower vibration. Now what the valves do is this is a trumpet in the key of C. And if you can imagine the air travels through here and then comes straight out the bell. If you use a valve, what you're in effect doing is adding on a piece of tubing. So the valve acts a little bit like a junction, a railway junction, where the air is diverted through an extra tube. And as you can see, the smallest tube is on the second valve here, and that will lower the pitch by a semitone. The first valve has this tube here, which lowers the pitch by a whole tone. And the third valve, has the longest piece of tubing, and this tubing here lowers the pitch by a minor third. And it's by using combinations of valve that you can get the full chromatic range. As soon as valves were invented, people tried to find new ways to express themselves, and one of these players who took advantage was a guy called Arbon, who wrote an instruction manual for trumpet players, but was also a real virtuoso of his instrument. And it became very fashionable with this new instrument to try and play as fast as possible. I'll play you a little bit of Arbon's Carnival of Venice variations on the cornet. In order to start a note cleanly on a trumpet, we use the tongue. And what the tongue does is it stops the air and then it releases the air. And when the air is released, hopefully, you get a nice clean start to the note. So the tongue is very useful for getting a nice clean start to the note. One problem is when you get to fast repeated notes, the tongue simply can't move fast enough. One of the most fundamental elements of brass playing is breathing, and you really have to have very good breathing and breath control if you're ever going to get on as a brass player.
But the trumpet is not the only instrument in the brass group. This group also includes the French horn, the trombone, and the tuba. All these instruments are called brass instruments because they are made of copper. But nowadays, brass, dural, and even silver are also used. We will continue our journey and visit the French horn.
Hello, my name's Katie, and I'm one of the two principal horns of the Philharmonia Orchestra. So I'm going to talk to you about the French horn. It's in the brass group of orchestral instruments. It sits on the right-hand side, slightly away, because we're slightly special. We're slightly special for a couple of reasons. I mean, fundamentally it's the same, because you make that bit of weird buzzing sound with your lips. We vibrate our lips to create the sound. That vibration then hits the mouthpiece and then travels through the horn like that. So it goes from an ugly sound to... Now, the horn is quite special. in that, firstly, it's played with the left hand, so the right hand. That is because a while back, before the valves were invented a couple of hundred years ago, we used to change the note with our hand. So like this. That doesn't really give you an even tone, so they added some valves so we can get all the notes without having that fuzzy sound. Another difference is that it's conical, so it starts smaller here and winds round and eventually gradually gets bigger until you get to the bell. So that's why it's slightly different to other brass instruments. It's great fun to play. One of the things I love most about the French horn is the variety you get. So in an orchestral situation, you can play some beautiful, beautiful quiet tunes, kind of creeping melodies, very haunting, very romantic, but also you can get some really exciting moments when the horns come blasting in, you get a bells up bit, and it just creates that little bit of extra added excitement. So there are two main composers who spring to mind when I think about people who are excellent horn writers. The first, from a while back, is Mozart. He had a very good friend called Joseph Leutgeb, and he wrote 4 concertos for him, one of which was made very famous by Flanders and Swan, which goes a bit like this. Lasts a bit longer than that, but you get the idea. The other one is Richard Strauss, who's a bit later on. Now, his father was a horn player, so he probably grew up with the sound of horn floating around the sitting room and the kitchen, that kind of thing.
The next instrument in the brass group is the trombone. The trombone comes from the 15th century. It is considered that the immediate forerunners of this instrument were backstage trumpets, which allowed a musician to move the instrument's tube when playing. Such trumpets were made to double the voices of a church choir. The timbre was very similar to that of the human voice. It was only necessary to make the similar intonation. That's why a backbone was made to give vibrato. The trombone has hardly changed in its design since its existence. The first instruments, essentially trombones, were called sagbutts. They were smaller than modern instruments in size and had several varieties according to the registers of singing voices which they imitated: soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. Some improvements of the sagbutts led to the appearance of modern instruments in the 17th century, which were called trombone. The trombone is an Italian word that means small trumpet.
This is the modern tenor trombone. It's been a member of the brass family of instruments in the symphony orchestra since the early 19th century, but its history stretches back over 600 years. The design of the trombone is very simple. It's a hairpin-shaped tube with a mouthpiece at one end and a belfer at the other. After about the first 2 feet of pipework, the tube bends to 180 degrees. The player moves the slide with the right arm and adjusts the embouchure to change the pitch. The first appearance of the trombone in the orchestra before the symphonies, it appeared in various operas, Mozart operas, and the trombone, because of its religious connotations, appeared at moments of supernatural or death or spirits and things like that. So it was very much associated with the supernatural. It does a bit of everything really, from very soft, lush playing to aggressive, traditional type. Rossini wrote a lot of, and Beethoven wrote storms, and the trombones appeared in the storm section of Beethoven's 6th Symphony and the William Tell Overture, Rossini, things like that.
So, we've met the trumpet, the French horn, and the trombone. And which instrument is the lowest of all the brass instruments? Originally, the serpent was used as the main bass instrument, but it did not produce a good and steady bass. The first attempts to build a new low-register brass instrument to replace the serpent were made in 1835 by German craftsmen Wilhelm Wieprich and Karl Moritz. In the course of their experiments, they created a bass instrument and called it a tuba. As a result of unsuccessful construction, they abandoned their invention. However, they did receive a patent for the instrument. Several years later, the Belgian inventor and musician Adolphe Sax got this instrument, improved its design, and achieved a perfect sound.
The tuba. The tuba is the largest of the brass family of instruments. It's also considerably the youngest of that family. It's the baby of the brass section. It wasn't around for 200 years or more after the rest of the brass section was fully developed. Now, when we play the tuba, we play it in exactly the same way as every other brass instrument ever invented. Now you can see the valves going up and down. The valves mean that I can play chromatically on the instrument. And obviously the other big thing about the tuba is that it is very long. It's probably 3 times as long as a trumpet, twice as long as a trombone, which means I can play very low. Now the only instruments in the orchestra that can play as low as the tuba can would be the contrabassoon and the string bass. And I'll just play a little bit of the low register. I think you'll agree that's very low. Now within the orchestra, our role is huge, and composers like Hector Berlioz will write for us in a very scary way, like he does in his Dies Irae from Symphonie Fantastique, which would sound a bit like this.
Well, friends, we have learned about the brass instruments, but there is another journey ahead of us. We are going to visit the woodwind instruments. Woodwind instruments have a certain kind of relationship to brass instruments. This similarity is based on the fact that air is needed to produce a sound. The word blow sounds like flatus in Latin. This is where the flute, a wooden wind instrument, gets its name. There is a legend of how the ancient Greek god of forests and grassland Pan fell in love with the nymph Syrinx. One day he wanted to catch the nymph, and Syrinx asked the river god to save her. He turned Syrinx into a reed. Pan made a flute out of the reed and named it after the nymph. Today, Pan's flute is a folk instrument made up of tubes of different lengths that make it possible to produce sounds of different tones. Transverse flutes are played in modern orchestras. It was created by Theobald Bohm, a German inventor, musician, and composer.
Hi, I'm Sam Coles. I'm the principal flute in the Philharmonia. The flute is a member of the woodwind family, and it differs from the other woodwind instruments in that it doesn't have a reed, and you make the sound by blowing across this little hole here and lengthening or shortening the tube with your fingers. This is basically a 19th century invention, the flute. Throughout the 18th century and up till about 1850, the flute was a conical instrument made of wood. But as composers started writing bigger and bigger symphonies and concert halls got bigger and bigger, there was a need for more volume and more dexterity in the instrument. And Theobald Bohm came up with this idea in the middle of the 19th century of making a cylindrical flute out of metal. Well, there is an interesting story about how he came to invent this flute. He was not just a flute maker, he was also a very fine flute player and composer. And he came over to England in the early 19th century, and he had the opportunity of hearing a great English flute player who was called Nicholson. And Nicholson was playing on a wooden flute, but he'd done some strange things to his flute. He'd made all the holes, made all the holes a bit bigger. And he made this absolutely huge sound and he played with great, great virtuosity. And so Boehm, who had never heard anything like it, said, he's got to do something about that. He's got to be able to combat this extraordinary flute player. So he went all the way home and started working on the new patent, which was going to be a metal flute, which was going to be cylindrical, with much bigger holes than the wooden flutes of the time. And so he actually invented this flute with the sole purpose of playing faster and louder than this great English flute player. And, well, he did. He succeeded.
It's time to learn about wooden instruments such as the oboe and the English horn. How did these instruments appear? The oboe originates from the ancient shepherd's pipe. The timbre of the oboe is delicate and a bit nasal in sound. Due to a few constructional features, the oboe almost never changes its tuning. That's why an entire orchestra tunes its instruments according to it.
The oboe started life in the Middle Ages as a shawm, a very old instrument, and it developed from the shawm into the first oboe in the Baroque times around 1680, 1690, and was used extensively by Baroque composers such as Handel and Bach. And the Baroque oboe was made of a different kind of wood to the modern oboe. It was made of boxwood, and it only had two keys at the bottom of the oboe, a C key and an E flat key, and the rest were just holes. But it had the double reed, and it made a fairly similar sound. Following this, the oboe developed into the classical period, where Mozart and Haydn wrote for it. It started adding keys as they went along, until it became a lot more developed into the 19th century, early 20th century, and changed to this grenadilla wood that we have now, and developed into the modern oboe. The wood that is used on the modern oboe is a lot heavier and more durable than on the Baroque and classical oboe, and also helps produce a darker sound. Most modern oboists make their own reeds, and to make a reed you start off with a tube of cane, a bit like bamboo, which you split into 3 pieces, and then you do a process called gouging on a machine, which makes it thinner, and you get it down to a very, very precise thin measurement. You then use what's called a shaper to shape the cane into the shape that you see now, and at this point you then fold over this piece of cane and tie it onto the staple, which is the piece of metal with cork on it, using thread, and then you use a sharp knife to scrape the reed very precisely, leaving certain areas thicker and certain areas thinner until you end up with the finished article. The modern oboe has approximately 46 pieces of keywork, the functions of which vary from simply covering the main tone holes, these 6 keys here, to trill keys, and also these keys on the back, which your thumb operates to help you play into the higher octaves.
And we continue our virtual journey and meet an instrument called the clarinet.
The clarinet is basically just a cylindrical wooden tube with finger holes, so that as I take more fingers off the instrument, the pitch will rise. Like that, and a lot of metal keys in order to enable me to play all the notes in between those notes, the chromatic notes. And some of that metal work is to enable us to play trills, for example, quite rapidly and efficiently. In order to make the reed vibrate properly, we curl our bottom lip over the bottom teeth, but the top teeth go on the top of the instrument. And we then have to close the mouth so no air escapes. Although some contemporary composers have actually started to ask specifically for a very breathy sound. The Argentinian composer Maurizio Cargil asks for various different categories of breathy sound, half breathy, breathy, and so on. So we have to actually nowadays learn to be able to control what we spent all our student years trying to avoid completely.
Come on, friends! We are on our way to an amazing woodwind instrument called bassoon. The bassoon is the lowest of the woodwind instruments and has a slightly hoarse timbre. The double-folded pipe of the instrument resembled a bundle of firewood. Therefore, its name comes from the Italian word fagotto, which means bundle.
My name's Amy Harmon and I'm principal bassoon of the Philharmonia Orchestra. The bassoon is a woodwind instrument and you play it by using double reeds, which are so called because it's two pieces of bamboo tied together, and when you blow it vibrates. You then attach it onto this metal pipe, which is called a crook, and the air goes in all the way down and up again. It's got a series of holes which are open and closed by pressing keys which change the pitch. It's got a very large range and you can play very low. And then also very high. And then everything in between.
The next instrument we'll meet is the saxophone. The saxophone is a woodwind musical instrument that belongs to the woodwind family of instruments, even though it has never been made of wood. The saxophone family was invented by the Belgian instrument maker Adolphe Sax in 1842. The creation was soon patented in 1846. The saxophone has a bright and powerful sound.
Hi, my name's Simon Haram. I'm a freelance classical saxophone player based in London. So of course the saxophone is very well known in jazz, rock and roll, pop music, not so well known for the orchestral repertoire. However, an awful lot of very famous composers have used it over the years. The saxophone family has many different members. It starts with the sopranino, which is about this big, and then it goes down all the way to the subcontrabass, which you have to stand on a chair to play. There are only a few of those in existence, I'm happy to say. More recently, the family has been expanded with the soprillo, which is a really tiny saxophone, and also a really interesting instrument called the tubax, which is a bit of a mixture between the bass saxophone and the baritone saxophone. Although the saxophone is classed as a woodwind instrument, it's actually made out of brass. It does have a mouthpiece and a single reed, very similar to the clarinet, but obviously it's a different shape and size. There are three parts to the saxophone: the main body, the crook, and the mouthpiece. The crook attaches to the body at the top. You slide it in, and then do the screw up a little bit to stop it sliding about. Then the mouthpiece attaches to the top of the crook. It just slides over the cork. If you pull the mouthpiece off, the instrument gets flat. If you push the mouthpiece further on, the instrument gets sharp. Next, you attach the reed to the mouthpiece using the ligature. The ligature slides onto the mouthpiece, and then you slide the reed underneath the ligature and just tighten it up.
Journey to the brass and woodwind instruments has come to an end. Goodbye, young music lovers!